The secret garden of letters. The garden was never meant to be a secret. When James carved the first gatepost with his hands, rough stone dragged from the fields, he had imagined a place filled with sunlight, roses, and laughter. A refuge where he and Margaret could sit on warm afternoons, sipping tea and speaking of futures that felt as bright as the flowers around them. But the world does not bend to the wishes of young lovers. War came, as it always does, snatching men from gardens and kitchens and sending them into fields where nothing bloomed but smoke. Letters became their lifeline, words scrawled under dim lamps, folded neatly, pressed with trembling hands. Margaret tucked them in the stone crevices of the garden wall, hidden beneath ivy and moss, where no one but she and James would ever think to look. "I'll come back for them," James had whispered on their last evening together, his voice shaking as he touched her cheek. "Every word I've written for you will live here until I return." But James never returned. The garden closed in on itself with silence. Ivy thickened. Roses wilted. The letters slept in the stone, unread, waiting. Decades passed. The world changed. The garden waited still. Elena Moore had never liked silence. Silence reminded her of all the things she couldn't control, the awkward pauses after her parents' arguments, the stillness that lingered after her divorce papers were signed, the quiet hum of a too-empty apartment in the city. So when she packed her car and drove 3 hours to the countryside, silence was the last thing she expected to find. Oakwood was a town so small it barely appeared on maps. A single main street offered a post office, bakery, a handful of shops that closed before sundown. Beyond it stretched fields of golden grass, forests that whispered with wind, and just at the edge of it all, the cottage she had inherited from her late aunt. The cottage was old, with shutters that sagged slightly and a garden gate that leaned tiredly on its hinges. Elena pushed it open and let the air of the countryside wrap around her. She inhaled. Wildflowers, damp earth, the faint tang of rain from the morning storm. "Not bad," she murmured, dropping her bags inside the door. The first few days were spent in small adjustments, dusting shelves, airing out rooms, discovering the quirks of pipes that rattled when she turned on the tap. She took walks along the winding lanes, nodding politely to neighbors who watched her with curious eyes. She tried bread from the bakery, buttery and warm, far better than anything she'd had in the city. Yet silence crept back. At night, the fields beyond her window stretched vast and endless, swallowing the hum of cars, the neon glow of city life. She found herself restless, listening for something, anything that would fill the stillness. On her fourth afternoon, while clearing the garden behind the cottage, she noticed the wall. It stood taller than the hedges, built of heavy stone, mottled with moss. At first glance, it seemed like any other old boundary wall, yet something about it pulled at her attention. Ivy climbed its surface in thick ropes, curling possessively as though guarding something. And then she saw it, a gate nearly hidden. Rusted iron, woven through with vines, its latch nearly swallowed by time. Elena hesitated. It was probably locked. Probably unsafe. Probably just another abandoned patch of earth. But silence pressed in around her, and curiosity stirred. She tugged at the latch. The gate groaned but gave way, opening onto a garden that had not felt footsteps in years. The air inside was different, denser, older, filled with the perfume of forgotten roses and the shadow of trees that leaned like sentinels over cracked stone paths. Grass grew wild, flowers bloomed untended, and everywhere the sense of waiting lingered. Elena stepped forward, brushing her fingers against the ivy. And there, tucked between the stones, something white caught her eye. A piece of folded paper. Her pulse quickened as she pulled it free. The paper was yellowed, fragile at the edges, yet the ink, though faded, was still legible. She unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Margaret, if the sea keeps me tonight, let this garden hold the truth I could never speak aloud. You are my breath, my home, my forever. Whatever fate brings, know that my heart is buried here among the roses." The words blurred as Elena's hands trembled. She looked around the silent garden, heart pounding. Who had written this? And why was it hidden here? She folded the letter back with care, holding it as though it were a relic. For the first time in months, silence no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, filled with whispers of the past. And Elena knew this garden had secrets. Elena set the letter on the kitchen table that evening, careful not to tear its fragile edges. The handwriting, looping, deliberate, undeniably masculine, pulled at her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a heartbeat pressed into words. She read it again, this time slower. If the sea keeps me tonight, let this garden hold the truth I could never speak aloud. The words rang with finality, as though the writer had known he might not survive. Elena's fingers lingered on the faded strokes of ink. Who was Margaret? Who was this man who loved her so fiercely? The mystery wrapped itself around her, replacing the quiet that had plagued her since her arrival. She couldn't stop thinking of the hidden letter as she washed dishes, unpacked boxes, even as she tried to sleep that night. By morning, curiosity had turned into determination. She returned to the garden with a notebook in hand, her eyes combing the walls and ivy. Hours passed as she traced cracks in the stone, her knees brushing damp grass, her fingers sore from prying at roots. At last, tucked into a higher crevice where ivy curled thick, she found another folded scrap. Her breath caught. This one was shorter, the ink smudged as though written in haste. Margaret, every day I dream of your voice. The waves thunder, the guns roar, but beneath it all I hear you, steady as the tide. Hold me in your prayers as I hold you in my every breath. Elena pressed the page to her chest, her throat tight. The man's love was raw, desperate, written as though each word were both anchor and farewell. She imagined Margaret waiting, tucking these letters into the wall with trembling fingers, her heart caught between hope and dread. A part of Elena envied her, the certainty of being so deeply loved, even in absence. Elena's own marriage had been a slow erosion, love diluted until there was nothing left but paperwork and silence. She folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the first, and stared at the wall that had hidden them for so long. There had to be more. The next week settled into rhythm. Mornings she spent tending the cottage. Afternoons she disappeared into the hidden garden. And evenings she sat at the table, transcribing each letter into her notebook before sealing them carefully in envelopes. By the end of the week, she had found 5 letters. They painted a story in fragments. James, she had learned his name from one signature, was a soldier at sea during the war. His words to Margaret pulsed with longing, but also with fear. He wrote of nights when the sky lit with fire, of comrades lost, of the thin thread of hope that she gave him. The garden became their sanctuary, and now, strangely, it was hers too. One afternoon, as she crouched by the wall brushing aside ivy, a shadow fell across the path. Elena looked up, startled. A man stood by the rusted gate, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tousled by wind. He wore a canvas jacket and boots muddy from the fields. His eyes, sharp gray, studied her with quiet curiosity. "Didn't think anyone lived in the Oldmore place," he said at last, voice low and even. Elena rose, brushing dirt from her jeans. "I just moved in. I'm Elena." He nodded once. "Daniel Whitaker." There was a silence between them, but unlike the kind Elena usually dreaded, this one was weighted with unspoken questions. "You're clearing this garden?" he asked, glancing at the wild tangle around them. "Not exactly," she admitted, then hesitated. "I found a something here." His gaze sharpened. "What kind of something?" Elena studied him. There was no malice in his face, only genuine interest, but still she hesitated. These letters felt like treasures, secrets not meant for just anyone. "Old papers," she said vaguely. For a moment he seemed ready to press, but instead he stepped back, giving a small smile. "This place has history. Folks around here don't talk about it much, but it lingers." Elena's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" But he only tipped his head politely and turned toward the gate. "Maybe I'll tell you sometime." And then he was gone, leaving her with the whispers of the garden and the letters in her hands. Elena couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Whitaker. His words, his look, the way he had spoken of the garden's history, as though he knew more than he had let on. 2 days later, she saw him again in the bakery on Main Street. He was leaning against the counter, speaking with the baker about supplies. When he noticed her, he gave a small nod. Settling in, he asked if she joined the line. Trying to, she said, though the house has its quirks. He smirked faintly. They all do around here. Elena gathered her courage. The other day, you said this garden had history. What did you mean? Daniel was silent for a moment, then gestured toward the tables by the window. You've got time for coffee? They sat with steaming mugs, sunlight slanting through the glass. Back before I was born, Daniel began, there was a woman who lived in your cottage, Margaret Davies. People said she had a sweetheart who went to war, but he never came back. She never married, never left town. Spent her life tending that garden of hers like she was waiting for something. Elena's heart thudded. Did she ever talk about him? Daniel shook his head. Not much. Folks said she kept her memories close. Some whispered she hid letters in the garden wall. Most thought it was just a story. Elena's hands tightened around her cup. The truth was heavier than rumor. It was right there in her cottage, in her notebook, in the fragile papers she had found. She looked at Daniel, torn between secrecy and the urge to share. Something in his steady gaze pushed her toward trust. They're not just stories, she said softly. I found them. The letters. His eyes widened slightly. You're serious? She nodded. For a moment he said nothing, then leaned forward, voice low. Then you've stumbled on something bigger than you know. Margaret carried those letters with her to her grave. Folks here, they don't forget. And not everyone likes old ghosts being stirred. A chill traced Elena's spine. She hadn't considered that. Why would anyone care about letters from so long ago? Daniel's jaw tightened. Because some secrets weren't meant to be uncovered. Elena looked down at her coffee, the weight of the letters pressing on her chest. She had thought she was simply piecing together a love story. But now she wasn't sure what she had stepped into. The next morning Elena stood at the garden wall, staring at the ivy as though it might whisper answers. She ran her fingers along the cool stone, seeking another letter. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of roses. Her search yielded another fragile fold of paper, tucked lower this time, nearly buried beneath roots. She eased it free with care. My beloved, each day the sea swallows another piece of me, yet your memory restores what I lose. If I fall, it will be with your name on my lips. Promise me you will not let this garden wither. Let it live, even if I do not. The words stole her breath. She closed her eyes, imagining Margaret receiving this, her hands shaking, her heart breaking. As Elena slipped the letter into her notebook, the sharp crack of a twig startled her. She turned quickly. A figure stood at the edge of the garden path, a woman older, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes, sharp and blue, studied Elena with a piercing intensity. You shouldn't be here, the woman said. Elena blinked. I live in the cottage now. I inherited it. The woman's gaze hardened. Then you should know better than to dig into the past. Some things are meant to stay buried. Before Elena could reply, the woman turned, moving briskly through the gate and disappearing down the lane. Elena nodded. She kept his secret. She tended that garden not out of grief, but out of devotion. It wasn't a grave, it was a promise. Daniel's gaze met hers, steady and searching. And you gave it back to her. To both of them. The silence stretched, but this time it was warm, filled with the hum of cicadas and the scent of earth after rain. Elena felt something shift between them, something fragile yet certain. For the first time in years, silence did not feel empty. It felt like possibility. Weeks passed. The letters were carefully preserved, catalogued, and stored in a cedar box that Daniel placed in the cottage, beneath the window that overlooked the garden. The town whispered, of course. Agnes frowned at Elena in the bakery, muttering about ghosts best left alone. But the whispers no longer mattered. One evening, Elena and Daniel sat together on the garden bench, the roses blooming wildly around them. The wall, once a silent sentinel of secrets, now seemed to glow with peace. Daniel's hand brushed hers, tentative at first, then steady. She didn't pull away. They waited a lifetime for their story to be told, he murmured. Elena smiled softly. And now it's ours to remember. The sky deepened to twilight, the first stars pricking the horizon. In the hush of the garden, the past and present folded together, the love that once was, and the love that was just beginning. And for the first time, Elena no longer feared silence. She embraced it, knowing it held more than absence. It held memory. It held love. It held forever.